to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. How are you, Tim? How was your Labor Day weekend?
There are busy days these days at PRI, so it was not as labor-free as I hoped it would be, but it was nice to have a 3-day weekend nonetheless.
Well, I was at my mom's, and I was just glad I was not at an airport somewhere. Like you, we've had a very busy summer, and it looks like it's going to be an incredibly busy fall. So it was just kind of nice to chill.
And the, kind of weird weather that we had over Labor Day weekend certainly added to. You didn't really want to go out and do much, especially on Saturday with all the rain.
Well, I wanted to ask you about, you were at a guest panel at the San Francisco Commonwealth Club about a week ago. The topic was the upcoming presidential elections. Now, I wanted to hear all about that.
Well, it was, I love doing them. They usually ask me a couple of times a year to come and do it. And it's very smart people who I'm always on the panel with. And it's, the audiences are very good and smart and up on the news as well. And part of it for good reason, because they have a news quiz at the end. And if you win a bag of Ghirardelli chocolate. So they have like 7 or 8 questions and everybody wins a bag of chocolate. So I think for good reason, everyone is on their toes with what's going on. But what I thought was really interesting was one of the key parts of the discussion was about the decline of Market Street, all of the quality of life issues and homelessness that we talk about at PRI, and especially in our work at the Free City Center. Now, being a San Francisco event, I would say the crowd that comes to these events are probably predominantly on the left. But, in another example of politics makes strange bedfellows. When I was talking through kind of our work, evaluating Project Home Key, for example, and all the $12+ billion we're spending with zero results, and how a lot of politicians, when they talk about homelessness, they're just talking about spending money. I didn't get any boos or hisses. I saw a lot of knowing glances and a lot of head shaking in the affirmative and people agreeing. And there was a visible gasp in the room when I talked about, as we've written about in our work, that in Los Angeles, these new kind of affordable housing projects and homeless housing projects that are being built with Project Home Key funds, and they cost upwards of $1 million per unit to build, and no one wants to live in them once they're built. So there really is, I think, a growing critical mass of we've got to do something different on homelessness. These issues that we're seeing of rampant shoplifting and whole downtown shutting down because politicians refuse to lead. I think you're getting critical mass across party lines of something different needs to be done.
I know, and San Franciscans have to wake up. They have voted in these very liberal politicians who have contributed to what they're seeing now. And so I hope that they have come to some realization that these policies, after decades, are not working and frankly getting worse. Well, let's turn to Sacramento. We've got a new president pro tem in the Senate, Mike McGuire. Any thoughts on him? What do you know about him?
Well, as if there wasn't enough happening in Sacramento, we decided to have a pro tem vote to elect the next pro tem. But obviously, he was very smart. One of the rules in Sacramento in a leadership election, and I've seen a lot of them on the Republican side, certainly up close, when you have the votes, don't dawdle. Take the vote. And obviously, he got the votes, and they decided that day to take the vote. I would say Mike McGuire is, he's not the flashiest guy. I would say he's known as kind of run-of-the-mill liberal from the North State, from Napa, Healdsburg, Humboldt, that neck of the woods. I would say if you looked at his voting record, he and Tony Atkins probably wouldn't differ on much. It was said in the coverage of the pro tem's election that there's a huge group of senators that are going to be terming out in 2024, and a lot of them wanted to make sure that had kind of a grown-up liberal take the pro tem seat, that one of the more new senators who came in after the 2022 election that are more kind of out there liberal, activist liberal, wild-eyed liberal, that they didn't want to have someone like that become the pro tem. So it's kind of seen as maybe a transition between kind of the more typical style of pro tem and maybe, a more activist pro tem would come in next. I think like Robert Rivas, temperamentally, have a more moderate temperament, be someone you could deal with, cut deals with across party lines. Toni Atkins certainly was very liberal, even on issues that, we're following, like single payer. She was an author of past single payer bills and a huge proponent of it. But she's someone you could do business with, someone you could cut deals with. And I think he'll be someone of that vein. So we'll see how long he'll be in there. At most, he could be in there for a couple of years before he's termed out. Looks like he'll probably take over sometime in the early part of 2024, and they'll have a transition during the fall. So we will see that. And then we'll see what the future holds for Toni Atkins, who has, placeholder campaign committees for, I think, lieutenant governor. Usually you create a lieutenant governor committee to park a lot of leftover state campaign money that you have. So we'll see what she might want to run for next. But certainly we weren't looking for a speakership vote, and, kind of happened out of the blue. But I think it'll be more calm and stability in the Senate with a McGuire as pro tem.
You mentioned Speaker Robert Rivas. Well, how's his tenure been these last few months? One committee that's been especially a thorn on his side is the Assembly Public Safety Committee, also known as Public Endangerment Committee. So characterize his tenure so far, and what do you think he's going to do about these committees? Some of these committees haven't been all that cooperative.
Well, when he came in, one of the things he promised is he's going to have a thorough review, and he's going to put his stamp certainly on the committee chairs and the committee membership. So kind of on the natural, next year's an election year. And even though we had a huge freshman class, you're going to see some members who are going to be leaving the assembly, whether they're going to retire, whether they're termed out, whether they're going to run for the Senate or run for Congress or run for some other office. Kind of early to mid 2024 would be a natural time to have a committee reshuffle. Well, I bet you when that reshuffle comes, whenever it comes, the Public Safety Committee is going to be at the top of the list for a major reshuffle. I mean, yes, when you're the speaker and you're a Democratic speaker, and when you have a large Democratic caucus, you have to balance a lot of interests. You don't want to get one group mad at you. You got to make sure everybody feels like they're being heard and that their, interests are kind of moving forward. But there's no question that the Public Safety Committee has been an embarrassment to basically all Democrats. Targeted members are having to go up on votes that are terrible votes that they don't want to have come back to haunt them in a future campaign. And there hasn't really been a sense of kind of political awareness or realism. There have been a lot of bills. The high profile ones have been on fentanyl, dealing with the fentanyl crisis, and this human trafficking bill that came up. Now, a lot of those bills were authored by Republicans, and yes, you may not like where those bills particularly go, but, a reasonable, rational, politically aware committee chair would look at those and say, hey, let's pick the least objectionable and move it forward, or let's sit down across the aisle and cut a deal and figure out what we can all live with and move forward on those. There's no movement on that, and there's no sense of reasonableness in how the committee operates. And like I said on homelessness, people across party lines are getting the sense of enough is enough on what our Steve Smith calls the mass victimization that's been created by these sweeping public policy changes, and a real refusal to fix what many would argue are unintended consequences of these changes in the laws. So I would bet that we'll have before too long a new chair of the Public Safety Committee who is at the very least a loyal Rivas lieutenant, who, when the powers that be say, hey, this is a hot potato, let's deal with it properly, they will deal with it in the right way. They won't cause more headaches for the speaker and for the caucus. And I would venture to say that will extend to the members who are on the committee. I bet you all the members of the committee going forward will be Rivas loyalists who will basically take orders from the top when a bill either needs to be passed or killed.
So, Tim, you mentioned the housing crisis. It's still front and center, not only in the minds of San Franciscans, but also really all around the state. Housing is incredibly unaffordable, causing a lot of young families to leave the state. And of course, it's been, as you mentioned, unaffordable for taxpayers who have the best intentions and want to shelter those who are homeless. So what's happening there on the legislative front? It's still a lot of unfinished business.
Yeah, so it continues to be a hot topic at the end of session. Right now we're about to start the last 2 weeks of the session, and we just had the Assembly Appropriations Committee suspense file. So now we know the bills that are going to be up for final consideration in these last 2 weeks. And housing continues to be a hot one. I would say the biggest bill is SB 423 by Senator Weiner that would basically extend some of the provisions, the changes that we've passed over the past several years to kind of loosen up restrictions on building and make it easier to kind of jump through some of this red tape that we've seen from CEQA and NIMBY governments that don't want to have any building. The issue is, that bill, has gotten through to the Assembly floor. The issue will there be any trouble in passing the bill? Speaker Rivas has publicly come out in favor of these bills. I would expect that if those bills ran into any trouble on the floor, he would, quote, speakerize them and put the weight of his office behind passing them through the Assembly. But there's so much more to do. And so really the question is, what is the issue going to be next year? Are the continued efforts we need to reform CEQA chip away at it? They're, of course, not doing what our Chris Carr said they should do, is to pass whole-scale changes to CEQA. They're chipping away at it. Will the chipping away continue? That will be interesting to see, and what kind of bills come forward. There's still a lot of controversy that even when the legislature is changing the law, these recalcitrant cities like Huntington Beach and a lot of cities in Marin County are basically thumbing their nose at the state, and the Newsom administration and Attorney General Rob Bonta are basically being forced to sue them to do what they're supposed to do under the law. We will see going forward kind of how those lawsuits shake out. It seems like the battle is now going to be shifting a little bit from the legislature to the courts, but it doesn't seem like anywhere on the horizon you're going to have the whole scale CEQA reforms that our Chris Carr has talked about in his study for PRI, the CEQA Gauntlet.
Thanks for that, Tim. Just one final commercial before we move on to our guest. If you're in the Los Angeles and Orange County area, or if you don't mind getting on a plane like Tim, he's getting on a plane, we have a great event coming up. We're hosting the one and only Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. So we're excited to have him. The dinner is at the California Club in Los Angeles on September 25th, and it's guaranteed to be a fabulous evening.
And go to pacificresearch.org/events to get your tickets now. So this week on Next Round, I think we added it up. He's the guest we've had the most in all of the time of our podcast, which is our Wayne Winegarden. And he's talking about the terrific new study that PRI released this week called the Free Cities Index. And what it is it's a measurement of the top 50 most populated cities in America for how pro-growth a city are there. Are more people moving into these pro-growth cities or moving away from less pro-growth cities? It's a really interesting study. Wayne goes through all the dynamics of the study. For those of you who are interested, you can go to our Free Cities Center site, which is pacificresearch.org/free cities. You can see where your city ranks and download the study. But, it's another thing that as we're talking about all these issues of crime, quality of life, homelessness, etc., downtown blight, all of this, it's pretty clear that policy is affecting people's investment decisions and people's where they locate and want to live and raise a family.
Well, I don't want to be a spoiler, but please listen to this because this is probably going to be no surprise, but several California cities rank down there at the bottom, unfortunately. Thanks so much for listening. Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast, Wayne.
Always so great to be here, Ro.
It's great to have you back on the podcast to talk about our latest Free Cities Center project, which we're calling the Free Cities Index. It's a ranking of how the top 50 most populous cities in the U.S. rank on issues related to freedom. So before we dive into the rankings, tell us about your thinking behind the Free Cities Index as you approach this project.
That's a really great question. Personally, I wanted to get a better understanding between the relationship of kind of the pro-growth policies and freedom within a city and this issue of population growth or population decline, because we really are having a very divergent impact on cities, where we have some growth cities and some declining cities in terms of the top 50, particularly in California, right, where we see so many of the declining cities. And so is that related to policy? I mean, that was kind of my approach. Can we connect this to the policy environment? Because you have cities in California, which, if you think about it, are really conducting very dangerous experiments. Right? If you go back, James Wilson and George Kelling, back in the early 80s, they came up with this broken windows theory of policing. And that was in response to disorder we saw in the 1970s. And you saw that implemented very successfully, I think most famously in New York City, where you took a city that was having a lot of the same problems we're seeing in cities now: loss of population, rising crime, declining opportunity. And they implemented these types of broken windows policies along with tax cuts, spending reform, welfare reform, reducing the bureaucracy. And like in New York, what you did is you turned crime-ridden Gotham into the safest city in the U.S. And so I think there's an important parallel. And so these were the thoughts that were behind my head. And can we link today these same type of trends? Are they the ones who are declining? Are they the ones that are implementing these really dangerous kind of progressive policy experiments? And how would people respond to it?
So, Wayne, as you note in the study, the rankings for each city were determined by an equal weighting of several different policy categories, along with several subcategories for each ranking. So explain your thinking in picking these categories, and what do these categories really tell us about a city's overall level of freedom and commitment to growth?
Well, something I used to work with Dr. Arthur Laffer for several years, and we always talked about maybe a pro-growth policy mix or supply-side economics, however you want to talk about it. But the idea is, whether it's at the city, the state, or the federal level, there's a mix of policies that's going to incentivize growth, it's going to incentivize prosperity, and there's certain aspects that need to go into it. It's not just taxes, although taxes are an important part, right? We don't want taxes that are excessively punitive. That's why we looked at what's the top marginal income and corporate income tax rates and average tax burdens. But other important issues are the regulatory environment, especially if you go to the national level and look at what the Biden administration is doing. The regulatory environment can be an incredible obstacle to growth. A broader policy environment, talking about, are we encouraging entrepreneurship and business startups, or are we discouraging that with red tape and labor laws that just make it too difficult for a business to operate? And then there's also issues outside of just pure economics that are really important. Not just an affordable place to live, but a high quality place to live, that where the government's providing the services that are important to people. And issues of are they homeless? That's such an important issue here in California. The problem of homelessness and all of the ancillary issues that follow on. So what we wanted to get that kind of different policy categories that captured all of these issues and looked at it from the terms of which cities are doing this in a more kind of pro-growth, pro-freedom way, and which ones are doing it more from a kind of a strong government presence, large bureaucracy, kind of more of a sclerotic kind of environment. And then kind of, again, look at that compared to population and see what's happening.
So let's dive into the rankings. So what were the top 5 growth cities, as we're calling them in the Free Cities Index rankings, and what do these cities have in common?
The top 5 cities are 2 in Texas, Fort Worth and Austin, 1 and 2. We have Colorado Springs, Colorado, and then 2 in North Carolina, Raleigh and Charlotte. And what they had in common is that all 5 scored particularly well across all 7 policy categories. I think it's important to note none of them scored exceptional in all of them. In other words, everybody has room to improve. But for the most part, these cities, they don't have a punitive economic incentive rates. In other words, the marginal income rates on personal income and corporate income aren't excessively high. They don't have high sales and property and tax burdens on your average family. Regulations are sensible. It's an affordable place to live that has a lot of the features and quality of life factors that people are looking for. So, across all of those categories, they don't have huge homeless problems. So they generally are implementing an environment that is encouraging freedom, that's encouraging economic activity, and also provide kind of those core public goods that people are looking for, and they're doing it in an affordable way.
So conversely, not everybody was a winner on our list. So who were the bottom five growth cities on the Free Cities Index, and what were some of the common characteristics that these cities that rated very low shared?
Right. Yeah. Well, when you're doing a ranking, right, there has to be a loser and there has to be a winner, right? But I guess what's important is these cities are not only relatively poor, but they were poor in an absolute sense as well. It's not going to surprise you that there's lots of California cities on this. So we're talking about Long Beach, California, Baltimore, Maryland, New York City, L.A., and then Oakland, California, being at the bottom. And it's in a sense it's a flip side of the top five, whereas the top five scored well across all of the categories. These cities pretty much scored poorly across all the categories, and in fact, were in the bottom 10 in many of them. So they were consistently imposing exceptionally high taxes, spending a lot, but citizens were getting very little. They all have large homeless problems. Have struggled with poverty. It's in places like Los Angeles and New York, incredibly unaffordable places to live, which makes it difficult, particularly for the lowest income people, but also, people who would otherwise seem like they're earning a good income. New York City, you could be earning $100,000 and actually living quite modestly. Whereas that type of income anywhere else, you would be living like a king. So it's all of those factors that these cities seem to be failing their populations on, and that was a bit surprising to me. But I think it's incredibly important to note that those bottom ones, not just relatively poorly, but in an absolute sense, are ranking very poorly.
So looking at the 50 cities in the index, what ranking surprised you the most? And was there a city with a general pro-free market reputation that had a poor ranking? Or conversely, was there a city not known for its pro-free market reputation that had an especially good showing?
I guess to me, the one ranking that took me by surprise, and I just spent a half hour at least just staring at it, was Dallas. And the reason why Dallas, Texas was such a big surprise to me was Fort Worth is number one, right? It was the best city. Well, it's the Dallas-Fort Worth area, but Dallas was number 23, which, I guess you could say is slightly above average, but it's quite a big difference between Dallas and Fort Worth, especially being in the same area. So I found that both surprising and kind of enlightening in terms of kind of how we went about kind of doing it. And the big difference between Dallas and Fort Worth, which really turned the difference between being the top ranked city and an average city, was one, Dallas is much less affordable compared to Fort Worth. So that affordability, being able to give citizens an affordable place to live, that clearly is something that's incredibly important. Dallas has also seen a slowing jobs market. So they were penalized for that compared to Fort Worth and some of the top performers. And then the homeless. And then besides the slower growth in jobs, Dallas has a larger homeless problem. And so that, just underperforming in some of these key areas is really the difference between being a top performer and an average performer.
So, Wayne, the Free Cities Index also explores population trends in what you call growth cities and stagnant cities and declining cities. So what are some of the examples of each of these types of cities, and what are the characteristics that distinguish them?
So when you look at the population trends, and we looked over from April 2020, which is the new census year, to the latest data, which was as of July 2022, and you really see kind of across these cities a pretty even distribution between, so what we said is, okay, if you're a stagnant city, then you're around zero. So we said plus 1%, minus 1%. Let's call that stagnant. So then greater than 1%, these are our growth cities, and if your population is declining by more than 1%, these are your declining cities. It's a bit arbitrary, but when you look at the data, it seems to fall into those three categories. And when you do that, what you get is 17 cities are declining, 19 are stagnant, and there's 14 growth cities. So your growth cities, and you see these at the top of our ranking as well: Colorado Springs, Austin, Texas, Miami, Florida is as well. Stagnant, there's Virginia Beach, Indianapolis, Albuquerque, New Mexico. Decliners, there's going to be no surprises here: San Francisco, New York, Boston, San Jose. Long Beach is also a declining city. And what you see, which is really interesting, is when you look at our ranking, and the average rank of the declining cities, stagnant cities, and growth cities, it just kind of forms that perfect pattern where the average ranking of the growth cities is 13. So your top cities by our ranking are also the cities that are growing. The stagnant cities are 22. So not as good as growth cities, right? But 22 is slightly above average, and it's certainly better than the ranking that the decliners had, which was 40. So in other words, the cities that were ranked at the bottom of our index are also those cities that are losing population, which kind of gets at that essential question that kind of started when we started talking about this. That the policy environment and freedom is interrelated with the cities that are growing and the cities that are declining, and so that I think is a really important insight that just can't be emphasized enough.
So looking at the rankings, what do you conclude about the relationship between how free a city is and population trends? So are people really voting with their feet by moving to cities that are more pro-growth? Just how bad do policies contribute to one's status as a stagnant or a declining city?
People are absolutely voting with their feet. I mean, that's exactly what we were just talking about. People are voting with their feet. There's an incredibly strong relationship between the kind of pro-growth policy environment and which cities are growing and which cities are declining. And I think it's important to say that some people, maybe most, I mean, it's hard to know when they're moving. They're not necessarily saying, "Oh, I'm moving here because of XYZ policy," but they may be moving there because, well, that's where the jobs are, or that's where you can get an affordable home. And so the policy environment is creating the kind of economic quality of life environment that people are attracted to. And that could actually be part of the danger, not understanding how the policy is undermining, how the policy is either promoting or undermining the environment that they want to see. And so that's always, I think, an important thing, hopefully that this index kind of emphasizes, is that the attributes that people want are best reflected by this pro-growth policy environment, so that people can start connecting that, hey, I moved to Austin or Fort Worth. I moved there because it had a high quality of life and it's affordable, but it has a high quality of life and it's affordable in Charlotte, and because of the policies that they're implementing. And really making that connection so that we can actually start not just ensuring that Charlotte stays Charlotte, but ideally, in our state, right, get Oakland to be more like Charlotte, get San Francisco to be more like Austin. So, these are the lessons I think we really need to learn.
So following up on that point, it's not surprising that California cities fared the worst on the Free Cities Index. I mean, the highest city in the state was San Diego at number 31, and all 9 California cities on the list ranked in the bottom 20, including 5 of the bottom 10. So what's going on in California that sets our cities apart from those in other states? And how much do the bad policies of a state overall impact the ranking of a city on the Free Cities Index?
So I guess there's two things. One, in terms of what's going on in California, is we're really ground zero for that progressive model. We talked about kind of we're doing an experiment, and just it really is kind of a live experiment on people, and it's not turning out well. It's failing. But this progressive model where we allow kind of crime to happen because that victimization, we don't promote businesses, we don't focus the government on providing kind of those core services. Remember, at the city level, right, that's where often people interact with the government their most, at that local level. Well, we have zoning regulations that require years to get something built. That's a really poor interaction. That's the model that we're doing in California, and it's failing. And when you compare that to, like, let's say, the revitalization of New York in the 80s, I think that's such a stark contrast in terms of the policy models that were employed and that the outcomes that we're seeing. So absolutely kind of that strong connection. In terms of policies at the state level, those are very impactful. And I think that's something that's important to emphasize. Some of the things that we looked at, we were only able to look at the state level, even though a local level would be more ideal. And other factors, the state income tax, that's, you can't just look at income taxes at the local level when you're trying to decide, do I want to live in Charlotte or do I want to live in Los Angeles? Well, you've got to include that state level income tax as part of kind of what you're considering, because that's most of what you're going to end up paying. So the state's impact is high, one out of necessity and two out of because you want to include those policies.
So as we close, what's your advice to the mayor of Los Angeles, the mayor of Oakland, or the leaders of any one of the bottom ranked cities in the Free Cities Index? What are the types of policies and actions they should be taking to reverse these trends and make their cities more attractive places to live and invest again?
I think that they need to take a hard look at themselves. You need to ask the question, why? Every city is different, both in terms of success and in terms of their struggles. And so for Los Angeles or Oakland, there are some similarities, but there are some differences. What's driving people away? So, some of the similarities is affordability, right? When you look at some things are state driven, like we just talked about, but some of the affordability issues from local zoning laws and local policies. So what can Oakland, LA do to change those zoning laws to bring down not just the cost of building new homes, which would help with our affordability issue, but also to reduce the time it takes to build so that you get more product on the market quicker? That would help with our affordability issues. So, there's a common zoning issue, a common policy zoning issues. That's something we should look at in both Oakland and LA, and something that we can do to directly address one of the factors that's driving people away, which is affordability. Another commonality is spending, right? Because instead of doing more with more, right, which is what politicians will always kind of frame the issue. Oh, we have a problem. We need to do something more, and we need more resources to do it. But what has been happening, certainly in California, and I think it happens more often than not, is that poorly run cities claim they need to do more, but end up providing less while taxing more. And that concept has to change. We have to figure out how to, do what, kind of focus on what public sector can do best. And we need to do that more efficiently and with less resources. So we need to kind of focus on kind of what are those core competencies? How can we do those more effectively? And so that budget of holding down spending, holding the bureaucracy to account, and bringing down taxes, again, going back to New York City in the 80s and 90s, that is something that LA, Sacramento, New York again, Boston, all of those cities need to look at. And the reforms are hard, but the evidence is showing they're achievable. And when you do achieve those goals, that you get the rewards. So there's many kind of potential benefits. And one last thing, very quickly, I think, which just for California is so important, is this housing first approach. And that's something that's there's state implications because it's official state policy. There are federal implications because the federal government pushes it as well. But pushing back against the housing first approach is an important issue that can address one of the factors driving people away, which is just the out of control homelessness issue.
Thanks so much, Wayne. And for listeners who are interested in the study, to find out where your city might rank, check out our study at pacificresearch.org. Thanks again. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.